Oh, there you go.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to wait a few more minutes to let everyone else trickle in, and we will get started shortly. Hello, everyone. Just waiting a couple more minutes. Okay. Hello, everyone. So it is now 8:03, so we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us for our discussion tonight on how students at highly competitive schools can stand out in college admissions. Okay, so this slide says that there will be a poll. The poll is being a little finicky at the moment, but if you could jump in the chat box and tell us if you are a student, if you are a family, your parents signing on, we'd love to know who we have with us tonight. Okay, so we are going to jump into some light housekeeping. So if you guys have any comments or replies to the questions that we have during this presentation, please feel free to use the chat box. Try not to use the raised hand feature. We can't see it. If you have any questions for the speaker, please put them in the Q&A and we will get to those at the end. Also, if you have the latest version of Zoom, you can turn on the closed caption feature. We will also be sending a recording of this presentation out to you tomorrow. So if you don't see it in your email, just check your spam. Okay, so now on to introductions. And I will let our speaker introduce himself.
Wonderful. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm Joel Butterly. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Ingenious. A little bit about me. I was born in the Boston area, but I actually grew up for like the latter half of my adolescence in Vermont, so kind of a rural guy. Went to Dartmouth College. I had two majors and a minor at Dartmouth. The majors were international studies and political science, and then the minor was ethical philosophy. After that, I took a year off between college and law school. I, after that, went to Yale Law School, where I studied international business transactions specifically. and started this company. So really, really happy to be here with all of you, and hopefully we can provide some quality information.
Thank you. And I am Dorothy Manforti. I am the Events and Email Marketing Manager here at Ingenious. My MFA is from the Savannah College of Art and Design, and my Bachelor of Arts is from King's College. Okay, so there are a few more members of our team that I would love to introduce you to, and those would be first our counselors. So we have a team of over 150 former admissions officers from top universities all over the country. Our counselors have worked at schools like Yale, Johns Hopkins, MIT, just to name a few. These counselors create a personalized admission strategy for the student that they work with. We also have our graduate coaches who work with our former admissions officers on a 2-to-1 team to implement that student strategy in their admissions. They are a great help when it comes to editing because each of our graduate coaches are graduates from top universities. They've gone through the process at these selective schools and used their knowledge to mentor and prepare their students. We also have a team of over 75 professors, scholars, and researchers for students with research interests in a variety of fields and topics through our academic mentorship program, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. So we use our school-specific objective insights from our former admissions officers to build a cutting-edge curriculum. Our systematic and operational curriculum is used to train and maintain our counseling team. We also offer unique and experiential academic resources to our students through our academic mentorship program. Students conduct research in their area of interest with a professor, researcher, or scholar. Some examples of these areas are a deep dive into the stock market, fundamentals of cancer biology, and many others. So our Leadership Innovation Lab empowers students to launch their own business, an organization, a platform, with the help of a leadership and entrepreneurship expert. We also offer many other academic resources available to our students, like internship pairing for students who want to gain practical work experience. We also offer test prep tutoring and subject tutoring to achieve top scores on critical exams and within their classes. So this last admission cycle, our students received 86 Ivy League offers, 420 top 30 offers, and over 1,250 total offers. All right, so some more about admissions data. So here is a true or false question for you guys that I would love if you could answer in the chat. True or false? Almost all valedictorians are admitted to Harvard. Let's see what you think. False? No. Okay. Pretty keen group here. I love it. Okay, so you guys are right. This one is false. Admissions is denied to almost 75% of high school valedictorians who apply to Harvard every year. Okay, so how applications are processed. Here's another true or false. Schools have algorithms to determine who is accepted or rejected. What do you think? False. False. Okay, yes. Very smart group here. So this one is also false. Most schools use a process of holistic review in which individual admissions officers assess every part of the application. So for example, Stanford is looking for a student with academic excellence and personal context, while Harvard is looking for individuals who will inspire everyone around them. USC is looking for students who have the potential to add to their diverse and vibrant campus life. And Emory is looking for students who can make positive contributions to their dynamic community. So do you know how these applications are reviewed in the admissions office? Okay. So after you submit the application you have spent months on, it gets sent over to the admissions office and they add it to their pile of application. Then the applications, get separated usually by region, and each admissions officer gets assigned a pile of applications to look through. Then that admissions officer reviews every page of every application and select a few that they want to accept. From there, the admissions team meets as a committee to debate and decide who should get admitted. So the takeaway from this is that if you don't make an impression on your admissions officer assigned to your file, they will not advocate for you. As a result, you won't be admitted. Your application has to make.
Sorry, I thought that was the end. Do you mind going back to the previous slide? I just wanted to point a couple things out quickly. So when you submit your application is going to be around 12 to 15 pages long. And when it's separated into individual regions, the individual admissions officer assigned to your region, they might read anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 applications per cycle. That's in the course of several months. Now, most schools have rules that prevent them from skipping over applications. They can skim, but they can't skip, meaning that they're going to touch on basically every single page of this application. And so what we're talking about there is these individuals, and over the course of 3 or 4 months, having to read anywhere from 12,000 to 20,000 pages of applications. It's the point of me telling you all of this is that the job of an admissions officer is kind of crap. It's not a lot of fun. It's going to be incredibly boring, especially given that the vast majority of applicants use the same types of information, the same types of ploys in their application. So it's incredibly repetitive. And that's why when Dorothy says that it is paramount that you stand out, that is part of the reason. So you are a one single application on 1,000 or 1,200 that this individual has to read. And whether or not you get in will often be determined by how differentiated you are from other students. So a student with great grades, great test scores, who does 10 different extracurricular activities at their high school and everyone loves them, unfortunately, while very impressive, is incredibly commonplace. Every high school has a student like that. And all of these colleges have ways of designating whether the fact that a student is qualified to be admitted but will get rejected anyway. So one of our admissions officers from Stanford said that they used to write qualified but not compelling, essentially meaning you were qualified to get into Stanford, you would be a good student there, but you're getting rejected because you don't stand out. Dartmouth was, I think, DNS does not stand out. Johns Hopkins was LMO, like many others. And so all these schools had different ways of designating students who were impressive, could succeed, if they were let in. There was no question about that, but fundamentally weren't differentiated enough. And that is sort of the way, I just wanted to highlight that because so much about success in the admissions process is understanding what actually happens when the application's in the admissions office and how you stand out from that massive pile of applications. Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah, no, you just reiterated the point that your application has to make your admissions officer want to fight for you. So they'll want to have to scream from the rooftops that you need to go to their school. So we have another true or false for you. So now that SAT scores are optional, college admissions process places less emphasis on academic success. What do you think? False, false. Yes, you guys are all right. Oh boy. Okay, so yes, that one is false. So a former associate director of admissions from Georgetown University said, frankly, the school transcript is the beginning point, even when testing is available. A strong transcript can mitigate the impact of an average SAT, but a great SAT rarely compensates for a weak transcript. AP scores and a challenging high school course selection will determine academic strength in absence of testing. The recommendations, interviews, and academic/extracurricular activities will also become increasingly important, as will the essays with this test optional policies in place. Okay, so here is a trivia question that you may or may not have already seen the answer to if you were paying attention during that tech snafu. but I'm going to act like you didn't see it. So out of the 14,781 students who got deferred from MIT's early action in this past cycle, which of them got deferred in the early action cycle? Let's see. Okay, I'm going to go with that you all are very smart and you didn't see the next slide because you are all right and it is A. So in the early action round, MIT deferred 9,489 students, making the regular decision pool even more competitive. To get in early to a top school, you have to stand out. Okay, so now I will pass it on to Joel.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we've talked about that you need to stand out, and now we're going to talk about how you stand out. We can go to the next slide. So there are kind of two different ways of thinking about how to stand out in the admissions process. So one way is sort of the hyper simplified version, which I often like to tell families because I think that it encompasses 85 to 90% of what you actually need to know. And that is that standing out is a factor of, number one, achieving what we call threshold academic qualifications. And I'll explain why I'm using the word threshold there. And B or two, whichever I used previously, a factor of cultivating expertise in a given field, meaning that you've identified a passion or interest, something like sports management or public health or biology or chemistry, and you've developed that interest to a point of actual expertise. That is sort of what allows you to stand out. Now, here we have a slightly more granular look at what helps you stand out. We still have the threshold grades and test scores, but the sort of expertise is disaggregated into leadership diversity and having a consistent theme or application persona. The only reason I tell you the sort of simplified version is that if there's anything you take away from today, other than the fact that standing out is critical and that you can't stand out merely by doing what everyone else is doing, but trying to do it better, which is what 90% of ambitious families and students do. It's that getting in is a matter of figuring out what the academic thresholds are, achieving them, and then cultivating expertise as early as possible in as specific an area as possible. So let's kind of dive in a little bit further. We can go 2 slides down. So we'll do another true false. 57% of students with perfect SAT and ACT scores applying to Stanford are rejected. Who thinks that's true? Who thinks that's false? We got trues, true, 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 true. There's a lot of consistency in the group's answers between these things. So one person is correct. So let's go to the next. John, it's funny, John. It's actually 69% of students, so not 56. It wasn't that small, but you know, I think oftentimes when we show this, people's immediate response is, well, that just means that if I don't have a perfect grade or perfect test scores, that my chances of getting in are basically nothing. And it's actually the opposite of what we want you to take away from this particular section. If you can go to the next slide. So each year, our estimate is that there's something like 2,000, as many as potentially 3,000 students who have both perfect grades and perfect test scores who are applying to elite US colleges. And that's just domestically, that's just the US based students. What that means to us is that any one of these schools could more than fill its entire freshman class with students with perfect grades and perfect test scores. And have plenty of students left over. The reality, though, is that they don't do that. The reality is that having the perfect grades and perfect test scores aren't helping you stand out any more than having grades and test scores that are good enough for the schools that you are applying to. We can go to the next slide. So this is a somewhat ugly but useful slide that explains how to understand grades and test scores and what a threshold value means. The barrier between the green and the red, that's the threshold. Above it means that you are now academically qualified. You can think of being academically qualified as almost a binary variable. You either are or you are not. It doesn't exist on a sliding scale the way many people think. A simple way of explaining this is that there has never been a time when colleges cared more about a 1600 than a 1550 on the SAT. They might not care about SAT at all anymore, but the point is that there was always a threshold, and that was sort of like the upper end of the threshold for the most selective schools. And so basically what you want to do is you want to achieve at or slightly above the threshold for grades and test scores, and then focus the remaining energy and attention on these other three variables: leadership, diversity, and an application persona, effectively your extracurricular activities or your honors and awards. You'll see this guy on the far right of the screen. This is a very common student that we've seen who gets really good grades and great test scores and thinks that the way to ensure that they're going to get into a good college is to absolutely kill themselves, spending every waking minute trying to eke out a few extra, decimal points on their GPA or on the SAT. And ultimately, their probability of success only goes up nominally. That is to say, it's a bad return on your invested time. So that's what threshold grades and test scores looks like. Another way of thinking about this for any economists in the room is a curve of diminishing marginal returns. Same basic concept, but that's sort of how we do it. Now, there's an obvious follow-up question, which is, okay, well, you need to get the threshold grades and test scores. Well, what are the threshold grades and test scores? A very kind of simple, a very kind of simplified way of thinking about this is it's at or slightly above the 75th percentile of admitted students, meaning that if you are at or slightly above the 75th percentile of admitted students at NYU for their SAT score, let's say it's a 1450, I'm just making that up. Getting higher than that means that you're academically qualified. Getting much higher than that doesn't actually improve your chances of getting in compared to just being over that number. So that's sort of how to think about it. Now, the reality is that the threshold is probably a little lower. I'm being conservative here when I say 75th percentile. It's probably closer to the median. Just to be safe, saying 75th percentile is quite helpful. So we can go to the next slide. So the takeaway is simple. I think all of you already know this. Great grades and test scores aren't unique. They're not enough to guarantee admission. They're only two of many other important factors. And increasingly, the reduction in the importance of standardized tests, while it has also propped up the importance of GPAs, will also increase the importance of all the other factors on your application, namely your extracurricular activities, your essays, your honors and awards, et cetera. So let's look at diversity and leadership. Somebody asked a question that I really liked, which is, what does diversity in this context mean? And that is a very good question. When I say diversity, most people think that what I'm talking about is religious, ethnic, racial, et cetera. Those are all forms of diversity. They are also forms of diversity that you do not have control over, or you certainly should not try to exercise control over for the purposes of gaining advantage in the admissions process. There are other kinds of diversity, however, and in the context of higher education, the sort of thesis of higher education has been increased diversity will result in greater levels of creative friction between students and professors. And as a result, more unique ideas will be spawned in class, on campus, or in alumni events. Certainly there is, certainly schools have gone to a great degree to increase diversity, but most people only spend time thinking about those limited forms of diversity: race, ethnicity, religion, et cetera. They don't spend a lot of time thinking about other types. Within higher education, diversity is anything special about a student that will allow him or her to contribute a unique perspective in the classroom, on campus, and as an alumnus. I once took a history of warfare class at Dartmouth with this great professor, Gene Garthwaite, who is retired recently. And it was interesting because you had a whole bunch of students from relatively privileged backgrounds, not a lot of life experience. They were all probably 20, 21. Opining on, Alexander the Great's conquests, and et cetera, et cetera. And then you had this one guy who was 32. He was a paramilitary rescue trooper, had bullet, scars all up and down his arms from being shot at. This was a guy who offered a very unique perspective to that particular class, one that was often terrifying. But the point is, that actually is the kind of diversity that schools are looking for. They're looking for someone who can offer a unique perspective. Diversity fundamentally is what allows you to stand out. And this will dovetail closely with with what we call the application persona. I'll explain what that is later. But diversity and application persona sort of go hand in hand. That is to say, the persona is the catchphrase version of what makes you diverse. We can go to the next slide. So here are examples of diversity. You have race, ethnicity, religion. These are things you cannot control. There are other types of diversity: unique academic interests, marine biology, Russian literature, unusual or uncommon extracurricular activities, starting a company or nonprofit, being a patent holder, being a published author, being an international prize winner, having an unusual diverse background insofar as you grew up in Guam or something along those lines. These are things that will all offer you or afford you a unique perspective relative to other students at these schools, and is what they are looking for. Now, I saw somebody made a comment about, does political stance count? I'd be very careful with that because you don't know the politics of the person who's reading your application. So generally speaking, I would say, be careful not to offend the admissions officers, many of whom share very similar or kind of similar leaning political beliefs. So if you go in there guns blazing with I am a radical libertarian, that might not play so well in today's admissions offices. Although they do want political diversity, you still have to account for the fact that the admissions officer needs to like you in order for you to get in. We can go to the next slide. The application persona. So the best way of describing the application persona is it's sort of like your catchphrase. If I were to summarize what makes you unique or special in just a few words, that's the application persona. It's the common thread that ties together your application, like what common interest, just get darker, what common interest or common passion drove you to your interest both in public health but also food science. That's sort of the organizing theme. Now, it's important to understand that the application persona is not an accident, it's a decision. So this is something, it's not a part of the application either. This is just this is a term that we made up. So we will often talk with students about application personas as early as 9th or 10th grade. And really what we're talking about at that stage is, what is it that you're really passionate about, that you really like doing, that we can start investing heavily in, so that by the time you apply, you're really an expert in this, kind of given field. When you're just about to go through the application process, as I'm sure many people on the call, on the webinar tonight are going to, you don't have the sort of liberty to kind of go back in time and choose an application persona and then build an extracurricular profile around it. Rather, you basically need to sit there with the list of all of the activities that you have done or that you're going to do, and figure out what is the common theme here. I am the blank kid. I am the kind of environmental justice kid. I am the environmental justice meets social justice kid. I am the public health in third world or developing nations kid. Those are simplified examples of application personas. They tend to be a little bit longer and a little bit, wordier, but you'll see an example in a case study a little bit later in this presentation. Finally, the application persona serves two primary purposes. Firstly, it makes you more memorable. It is extremely hard, if you're reading 1,000 to 1,500 applications, to remember an application in which every single page was about a different student, meaning, one student giving their 10 different dimensions to their personality. I'm a philanthropist, I'm an athlete, I'm a student scholar, I'm a researcher, I'm a debater, et cetera, et cetera. That is incredibly hard to remember. How would you summarize that? It's not going to, it's not, your memory is not going to recall that quickly. On the other hand, if you have an application that has a large underlying theme, like let's say it's the environmental justice kid, it's very easy to remember that. And memorability, people kind of underestimate how important this is in the application process. Whether or not you are remembered by the admissions officer in a lot of cases governs whether or not you get in, because they need to flip back to applications. They need to they'll often mark an application to be reviewed again later, things like that. So being remembered is important. Second is persuasiveness. So for anybody who's done debate, for anybody who's done debate, it's sort of a truism that it's better to have one really strong argument than 10 really weak arguments. Having an application persona is your one really strong argument. This is what makes me diverse and what makes me different from other applicants. Having sort of, a whole bunch of different things that you're trying to highlight simultaneously makes you a little bit something of a dilettante. We can go to the next slide. I saw this is a good question from John. So essentially you want to have a varied interests, but a common persona to tie them all together. Not exactly. So what you want is a persona that as a theme, right? Let's say it's environmentalism, applies to multiple extracurricular activities. So I think that the way you're asking it makes me feel like what you're saying is, I do soccer, I'm interested in public health. What is the theme that makes me like these, like the common theme? That's a little bit more tenuous. What I'm talking more about is like, you sit down in front of your activities list and you say, okay, I have debate, I have some political research that I've done. I went to Yale Young Global Scholars. My theme is political science or government or international relations, et cetera, right? That's sort of what I'm talking about with an application persona. And when you're building one from a younger age range, when you're starting from say 9th or 10th grade, you come up with an application persona that is essentially just a statement of what you are most interested in. Like, I'm really passionate about computer science. And then you build an extracurricular profile around that. You do multiple different types of extracurriculars, starting from small things that you do in school to more advanced things where you can gain leadership experiences, to what I would call capstone experiences, which would be those research opportunities, starting a company or a nonprofit or some other kind of original organization, or internships. Those are kind of like the highest level, which in my mind, the reason that we developed those programs was because my thought was that that is one of the fastest ways of conferring expertise. There are very few other ways of conferring expertise as a high schooler. And confer probably is the wrong word. I think I mean convey. This is what an application persona looks like on an application. So this is a real application. The student got into Harvard and Columbia and Dartmouth. This is a few years old. One thing to note is that this is the activities list. This is what it looks like in a preview of the Common App, or at least it's what it did look like a couple of years ago. And it's worth noting that the kind of top 3 things are relatively consistent with one another, right? So we're not like a student who doesn't have an application persona. You'll see that the activities is sort of like environmental, student government politics, then there's going to be some sort of philanthropy, then there's probably music. And so everything is sort of a different category and there's not much consistency. Here, our 3 most important activities have some level of internal consistency. If you buy that an astronomy club and environmentalism are somehow related, which, that's somewhat tenuous. Here's a good question. How do you differentiate a persona if it's very common? So the first thing to know is don't lie. Do not try to say you're interested in Russian literature to hack your way into these schools. They're way too smart for that. That worked for like a couple of years, a decade ago. It doesn't work anymore. So you have to be sincere, right? You have to choose a sincere interest that you've actually invested a significant amount of time in. The second thing is be as specific as humanly possible. If you are interested in biology, you need to go a level deeper, right? So maybe it's evolutionary biology, maybe it's biochemistry, but going kind of one level deeper is a super important way of differentiating yourself and getting yourself out of a really common pool, because biology and government might be some of the most common majors. And if you say you're interested in those things, those schools are only going to take so many students who say they're interested in biology and government. You're putting yourself in a population that is going to be artificially limited, and you know it. But if you're more specific than other students, it can be helpful. The other option would be something like, there's a lot of students who are interested that we work with who are interested in like political science, and government will focus instead on PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics, which is very much in keeping, but it's sort of it's a different name. It's a different name. It might be in a different department. There's a kind of really unusual major that is application only at a few schools, a very kind of competitive school, and it's called social studies. The major, it's an amalgam of different of different disciplines. But that's another way of sort of touching on, that would be for students who are interested in like the social sciences and things like that. So you can also do a little bit more research on the majors and find something that's a little more specific. But high level piece of advice is choosing an interest that is at the level of a college major, in terms of specificity, is inadequate. You want to be thinking about this in terms of the level of specificity of a college class. So biology is a department, evolutionary biology is a class, probably. So that's sort of how you'd go about differentiating that. The other thing is, like, you also go about differentiating yourself by building on your extracurricular activities. It's like, even if you are in biology, and that's super common, if you're a published author, if you've built we had a student, it was 2 cycles ago, who built a nonprofit. He was interested in eventually going to medical school. His interest was biology. He built a nonprofit that raised money in the US to buy water filtration devices. And then he sent those water filtration devices to NGOs, resource-strapped NGOs in developing countries and developing regions that had experienced some sort of natural disaster. One of the things that he had read was that one of the major causes of death after a natural disaster is actually not the disaster itself, it's the ensuing starvation, unclean water, things like that. And through this process, the student actually saved lives. Like, it doesn't matter if you're if you're interested in biology, and that's super common. If you've done something like that, you're almost certainly going to a highly selective school, as long, presuming that you have the right academic qualifications. So that's the other part, I guess, to the answer. So we can go to the next slide. So applying these lessons to your application, and how do you stand out in the admissions process? So the question that we often get asked is, how will my student be compared to students at other high schools? And typically, your student will be compared to, or you will be compared to, other students at the same high school or high schools that are of a similar level of competitiveness, meaning the kind of local New Hampshire public school, you're not probably getting compared to the students at Phillips Exeter. That's not likely. But what that means is that the standards for students at selective schools are higher. So to add complication to this, I'm going to use just really simplified numbers. If you go to a really, really elite private school, chances are that if you're in the top 15% of your grade, you are qualified for at least some of the schools in the top 10 to 15. Whereas if you are at a mediocre public school and you're not number 1, you're probably not in the running for any of those schools, which is essentially saying that one of the benefits of going to these schools is that you could be lower ranked and still get into these really elite schools. However, the kind of countervailing effect is that because those schools are more competitive, it's harder to do well in those schools. So what I often see is families struggling with the idea of sending their kid to private school. And once I tell them, listen, if you think your student is going to go from being in the 75th percentile to the 50th percentile in private school, do not send them. That's probably not a great idea, unless there's other educational justifications, like the student needs a lot more teacher support, needs smaller classes, et cetera. But if it's just a question of, getting the student into college, that's not a good trade-off. So anyway, here's what one of our former admissions officers said: if you're at a college that gets a bunch of applications from one school, you have to be so discerning about what makes someone stand out when everyone is so strong. It means being even more critical about their grades, courses, recommendation letters, but also looking for qualities that make the applicant different from the rest. We flip to the next slide. So question here is being well balanced in extracurriculars. So the concept of well-roundedness really never was, it was always a myth. It's never really been the case that schools wanted well-rounded applicants. They've always really wanted well-rounded classes. And well-rounded classes are not consisting of students who have done a small amount of a lot of things. They consist of students who have advanced interests and expertise in those interests, and have been committing their time to it over the course of as much of high school as possible, let's say, and possibly even before. So that is to say, there's an educational benefit aside from the admissions consideration to trying different things, right? There's like, it's good to try an instrument. It's good to try team sports or sports generally. These are useful experiences that students should have, sort of in the development of a young mind and a social entity. But the thing that really gets you into school, the thing that really differentiates you, is the element of interest that you heap your time on, right? It's sort of like, you can almost think about it as the difference between a circle as a well-rounded student, and you don't want to be that, but like a tiny circle with a big spike on the top of it. The spike is sort of that's your persona. It's what makes you diverse, et cetera. In terms of being engaged in the community service is extremely important. I strongly recommend everyone do it, not just because it's good for getting into college. One thing to note is that community service, like everything else, should be related to your application persona. So, and I see a lot of students who do a lot of time doing Habitat for Humanity, and that's wonderful, but it's pretty clear from their application that they did that exclusively for the purposes of getting in to one school or the other. Much better would be to find community service opportunities that are related to your core interest. The simplest way of doing this is to basically teach underprivileged students a subject matter you're really passionate about, like coding. That's a good way of reading, or reading. That's a good way of giving back in a way that's related to your interest, if you're interested in, say, literature. There are a lot of other different ways to do it. That student I mentioned who did the water filtration devices, that's a really cool way of doing community service and building your own organization to do it. Which slide are we on? We can go to the next slide. So these are just a few schools, really elite schools, and their sort of AP enrollment, their average SAT, their average ACT. Part of what I want you to take away from this is just the admissions officer assigned to these schools, right? So there will be one admissions officer, almost certainly, who reads every application coming out of that school. And they're going to compare students within this context. So if AP enrollment, let's say that the average number of AP tests taken at Stuyvesant is 5 and the max is 10, right? Your sort of threshold level is going to be in the kind of 7 to 8 range. Roughly at the 75th percentile. So that is obviously different than at TJ, at Thomas Jefferson, where 72% of students are enrolling in APs. The average SAT, same thing. Average ACT, same thing. Here's a question. The activities list in the example are added to 30 hours per week. It is about 4 to 5 hours per day, not counting the homework and study. There are only 5 activities in the example. This is an interesting question about like how the hours add up. 30 hours a week is not egregious. Admissions offices sort of anticipate that you'll inflate slightly. Everybody does. It's not me encouraging you to do it. It's just sort of what happens. But you can't inflate too much. We once had a student who sent us their kind of rough draft of their activities list, and the hours that they listed added up to more hours than there are in a week, which is a bad look. It's very not credible as a statement. Doing 4 to 5 hours a day of extracurricular activities is on the higher end, but certainly not unheard of. But again, I think the other thing to consider is that these activities did not necessarily run year long or year round. So they might have only been doing 2 of them at one time and then 2 at another time, rather than doing them all concurrently. Another question, how differently are gap year students evaluated regarding extracurriculars and academics? Similarly, doing a gap year does have some benefits. In terms of getting in schools like students who have, learned more about themselves and spent a little more time in the real world, so that can be super useful as well. But fundamentally, they're not looked at completely differently. You'd have to be kind of years out of high school for that to be the case. Let me go to the next slide. So what a 4.0 means at different schools. So fundamentally, when you are coming from a really good high school, you're going to be compared to other students from that really good high school. And what that means is that you're all likely to have really good GPAs because you're all competitive. You've all worked very, very hard. So it's harder to use that as a way of kind of standing out. It means that other elements of the application, things like courses, like what courses you take and how difficult your course load was, your letters of recommendation, that's huge, your extracurricular activities, that's huge. Those are going to be the things that sort of differentiate you if you're coming from a highly competitive school. We can go to the next slide. So when schools consider students' academic records, they want to see a high GPA. Ideally, they want a GPA that has been high and stayed high throughout high school. Second best option is started low, went high. Worst option is started high, went low. But ultimately, you need to understand that the rigor of the classes that you take and the content of the letters of recommendation matter a ton. Something that I see a mistake students make all the time is they assume that their level of control over the letter of recommendation is asking a teacher and then kind of walking away. And that is a terrible, terrible waste of one of the most important parts of the application, because most teachers who get asked for letters of recommendation get asked by numerous students. And that is a big ask. It takes time, right? Minimum of an hour per letter, probably. If you're writing it from scratch, considerably more than that. And so if you're a teacher who's not getting paid very much and who's certainly not getting paid extra to write these letters of recommendation, and you get asked from 10 students, hey, can you write a letter for me? Most likely what you're doing is you're using some type of some kind of template that you're making for students, just a little bit more generic. Probably not going to be as helpful for you. So it's important to go to these recommenders. You go with a resume, you go with a writing sample or homework sample. You potentially go with, bullet points. Like, here are the things that I was hoping you might be able to touch on. It can be a little bit awkward, but ultimately they're not going to put it in their letter if they don't agree with it. So it behooves you to help them as much as possible. So when they sit down to write, they have the information they need right there, very easily accessible to write a great letter for you. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Course load. Students who want to stand out academically need to take the most rigorous course load, especially in their subject of interest. Meaning, if your school offers AP classes and you're really interested in biology and you didn't take AP bio, that's weird. So in kind of the rule of thumb is you need to be advanced and take the advanced classes in the given field of interest if your field of interest is an academic one. For STEM students, that includes top math and science classes, going above Calc BC and high-level science courses as well. You kind of need to balance the numerical GPA with the rigor of the classes that you take. Obviously, if you just take the most brutal classes nonstop, your GPA is going to suffer. The goal is to not take necessarily the hardest possible course load of any student in the school. The goal should be something like being in the kind of, like, let's say, top decile, top quintile in terms of the difficulty. It's very hard to gauge what that means, and it's extremely school dependent, I understand. But if you are like beating out everyone else, by 5 honors classes, you might have overshot by a little bit. You don't need to be quite that rigorous. And the reason this will become important is when your college counselor fills out the school report, which you will never see, but it's very important, and it gets sent to the colleges. They'll indicate whether or not your course selection was the most rigorous, average rigor, below average rigor. And so that's going to be an important part. Other things that they'll be on the school report are things like, whether or not you play well with others, whether or not you're, well liked, sociable, whether teachers like you, whether you're a good student, et cetera. Also a small recommendation will be there as well. So next slide. So students taking and excelling in Calc BC as sophomores will be competitive for top tier schools such as MIT, whereas students taking it in junior year will be more competitive at second tier technical schools such as Georgia Tech. The top students should be taking post AP level coursework senior year and maxing out their class options in their desired field. It's essential for students to maintain a rigorous course load at senior year, including taking a math class. Don't let that fall off. Schools will see what you're taking in senior year. If your school doesn't offer Calc BC as a sophomore, then you are exempted from that requirement. Although there are options to do that online. So there are online high school credit options where you could take it earlier if you really wanted to. But if your school just simply won't permit it, then you have your answer. Extracurriculars. I mentioned earlier there are 3 types of extracurriculars I consider kind of capstone experiences, and those are academic research with publication, not always a publication, but publication helps. The internships and some kind of entrepreneurship, meaning starting something new, whether it's a platform or a company or a nonprofit. Those are all kind of capstone experiences. Here we have an admissions officer highlighting the positive effects of one such capstone experience: research, in particular research, published research. Certain scholarship reading teams loved when a professor or research lead provided a great a letter of recommendation. Another benefit of research is that if you do a good job, the professor or whoever is supervising it might write you a letter of recommendation. That goes a long way. When you're applying to a college, to get the letter of recommendation from a professor can be impactful. We can go to the next slide. So many students focus heavily on academics and are involved in the same types of STEM-related extracurriculars, such as ISEF or other similar competitions. I, generally speaking, think that competitions can be fun, a good learning experience, but they have a bad return on investment. And that's because they take to win a competition that matters, like ISEF. It takes a ton of time, and the probability that you win is incredibly small. Whereas if you focus on research, internships, and some kind of entrepreneurship, the time investment is comparable. The certainty of its impact on your application, meaning the certainty that it dramatically improves your application and your admissions chances, is way higher, right? It's, if you actually do the work, it's closer to 100%. That it will impact your applications positively. Whereas ISEF, let's say it's 1%, maybe. And because if you get like 10th place, it's not going to do much for you. As a result, students need to consider each of their extracurriculars and showcase a high level of participation that maximizes impact. We can go to the next slide. Here are some opportunities that we recommend. Leadership, you should have an extracurricular with at least one traditional leadership title. I'm the president of, the robotics club, something like that. Leadership is most valuable when it is related to your application persona. So being captain of the soccer team helps, that is leadership. But if you're really interested in public health and you are the head of like a student public health consortium, that's even better. Practical experience, internships, job shadowing, independent research. I think that's one that any student who's applying to a highly competitive school these days should strongly consider doing independent research. It's applicable to basically any area of interest. Whereas, things like entrepreneurship really are only applicable to students who are interested in certain kinds of things. But that's the last thing here: impact, creating something that didn't exist or helping an organization or project grow. Colleges, when they accept students, they are trying to find individuals who are going to leave a lasting and original impact on campus, in class, or as an alumnus. The best way of determining, if you ever heard the saying, the best way to predict what happens tomorrow is what happened today. So too, the best way of predicting which students will do that is which students have already done that. And so a student who has already left some kind of original mark on their community or on their school, that's going to be a student who they want to have on campus and in their alumni pool. We can go to the next slide. So some tips for creating an application persona. Do STEM a little bit differently. This is what I was talking about with, you can kind of choose related majors, right? So instead of doing like just bio, you could do public health or, food science or zoology, or you could be more specific. So do STEM differently. To showcase your personality. Remember that most of the admissions officer, or a lot of the admissions officers who work in these schools, went to the school that they are doing admissions for. This is true a lot of the time. And what that means is that if they admit you, it means that they would like to see you on campus or in alumni events. So you have to be likable. Do not be morose and maudlin, because that's in movies about college admissions. It's always the student who writes the most depressing essay that gets in. That's just not the way that it works. Don't be afraid to be funny. Being funny is just as helpful to getting into college as being like really, really sad and having overcome a lot. Maybe not exactly as much, but similar. But there's basically no students who try funny, and every student tries sad, and oftentimes unsuccessfully with the sad part. Lastly, find unexpected connections. So finding unexpected through lines between your academic strengths and other elements of your application, basically finding like what unites these different experiences and these different passions that I have, also known as the application persona. That can be extremely helpful. We can go to the next slide. Letters of recommendation. Letters of recommendation are super important because it's the only like third-party objective piece of insight into into you. And so everything else comes from your own mouth. So this can be extremely important. As I mentioned, you should not underestimate how much influence you have over it. It's important to do the letters of recommendation right. Don't just ask and walk away. It's not a set it and leave it kind of or set it and leave it. I don't think that's the saying, but it's not a set it and walk away, set it and forget it. That's what I'm looking for. It's not one of those. Whenever possible, an additional recommendation from someone such as a research supervisor, preferably a professor, can be super helpful. You can go to the next slide. Additional information. I would encourage everyone to be very, very careful about what they put in this section. We use it often, but it is important that that section is used correctly, meaning it is expanding upon something that did not have room. Usually in the activities list is the most common. Just using the additional information section to write a whole additional essay that did not need to be there is not going to be well regarded by the admissions office. So it has to be something where if I were reading your application, I would say this specific student needed additional room. If I read it and I sort of like, this student just did something that every other student could do but didn't, then you're going to look bad. But so the additional information section can be very useful. Next slide. For scholarships. So it's rare for multiple students to be awarded the same scholarship in the same cohort at most top schools. So you could take this into consideration when you build your school list. Okay, let's move right along. I know we're right about the end of our time, but I wanted to through this. So this is student S. This is a case study, one of our students. So the student is a top student from TJ, really quality GPA. Originally had sort of weaker SAT scores, but then we kind of encouraged him to take the ACT. Areas of interest in neuroscience and biology. So next slide, the student attended a really competitive high school. Most of his peers wanted to apply to top colleges, had great STEM experience. Neuroscience and biology are very competitive fields. There's a lot of students interested in them, more biology than neuroscience, but neuroscience is quite popular these days. The student had a lot of research under his belt, but he needed to find a unique approach to his application. The student also had too many academic commitments, wasn't sure of what extracurriculars to prioritize. Usually, I would say 80% of a student's extracurricular time when we meet them is spent on things that are unlikely to actually help them in the admissions process, which means that unless they love them or unless there's some other educational benefit to them, they're probably not needed. So we created what we call a candidacy building roadmap. Candidacy building is the process by which we work with students to improve their candidacy for college. And so we're working with them anywhere from grade 8 all the way through till they start working on the application around this time or later. We put together meeting schedules, detailed meeting reports. We put together what's called the extracurricular enhancement plan, which is where we go through stage by stage how you're going to develop an interest into expertise and the different levels of extracurricular activities that go along with that. We have a lot of databases for opportunities that our counselors can work through to find students like the best opportunities for public health extracurriculars. Standardized testing, and then kind of building the student strengths and weaknesses chart and more. We can go to the next slide. For every student, we do strengths and weaknesses. I'm not going to go into too much depth here. We can go to the next slide. We started off with 5 main strategies to address the student's weaknesses. We hope that the student would develop more into a STEAM applicant instead of just STEM. This is really popular these days. I personally don't love it. I think STEAM encompasses way too much, but it is popular and it was a good strategy. So we also wanted to prioritize extracurricular activities that will showcase the student's human side. We can go to the next slide. So the student wasn't going as well with doing as well with SAT, so we encouraged them to do ACT instead. He achieved his target score of 35 overall, which is very good. That is at or above the threshold for basically every school. And so that will put him in good standing. We can go to the next slide. Connecting his interests, the student's bio on this website detailed how he'd been inspired by positive impact on the brain, the positive impact that music has on the brain, therefore connecting music to his interest in neuroscience. So this was one way of taking disparate interests that were not related to the same persona and merging them, right? Basically doing, music and neuroscience as opposed to just neuroscience alone. And that way he can pull in all of his musical achievements into this application persona. It's a good strategy generally. By the time the student had transitioned to our application counseling program, that's where we work on the applications themselves. He established himself as also interested in communications and arts alongside science. So here was his application persona. It's a bit of a mouthful. Future science investigator using communication as a tool to promote medical knowledge. Actually, it's not that much of a mouthful. And it's not really supposed to be. It's supposed to be short. Usually they're even shorter than this. This is basically what informs the other parts of his application. So the idea is we want somebody not knowing what this persona is to read his application and to come away with a summary that approximates that statement. That's sort of how you can think of the persona. This theme was unique to his activities and ultimately would distinguish him. Again, the persona is just a catchphrase version of what makes you diverse. We can go to the next slide. The students had their eyes set on some very, very competitive schools. We suggested colleges such as Yale and Harvard. We could combine neuroscience, public health, and food sciences. These schools, you have to understand, no matter how talented you are, these schools are not just reach schools, but ultra reach schools for every student. There's no guarantee. You're never good enough for such that it is a target at these schools. We can go to the next slide. Ultimately, we do a lot of school research about the personality of schools and the social life there, and also the academics and the professors. And so we're really trying to find students a school where it's not just the most competitive school that they can get into, but it's really the school where the best fit, where they're really happy. We're really proud of the fact that in 10 years of running and working with thousands of students, we've only ever had one student that we know of that didn't make it through college, and it was for financial reasons, not for reasons that they didn't like it or reasons of inability. So fit, super important, and should be to everyone. The reality is that the number one variable that correlates with success and GPA in college is happiness. That is a slew of studies have shown that is quite important. So if you think you can just gut it out for 4 years and be miserable, the answer is that you probably can, but your GPA will suffer. And you will as well, which you don't need to. This student visited Yale, liked it even more. We can go to the next slide. We can go to the next slide. This is the student's final activities list. So something to note is that there is a clear application persona that emerges just at the top of it. That these things are relatively consistent. And that's really what you're looking for. We can go to the next slide. We took advantage of the additional information section. We actually included summaries and links to his published articles, which can be helpful. We can go to the next slide. This is what it looked like at the end. We can go to the next slide. On the personal statement, since there are so many other parts of the application that touched on his application persona directly, what we decided to do in the personal statement is really showcase personality and personal history. So that's a good thing. It's sort of an introduction of this person as a human to the admissions office, and the rest of the application did the sort of hammering in of the application persona, but the personal statement humanized him. So you can go to the next slide. It's not uncommon for us to go through, 20, 30 rounds of revision on one of these personal statements. We can go to the next slide. Before we arrive at something really great. I mean, the reality here is that it needs to sound convincingly like it is written by the student themselves, and it needs to be, not just for ethical reasons, but also for practical reasons. If I write an essay for a student, you think that an admissions officer is going to think, oh, this is written by a 17-year-old girl in Virginia versus this is written by a 34-year-old man in Connecticut? No. So it needs to be sort of authentically the student's voice. And the best way of doing that is a lot of rounds of revisions. You can't just rewrite things for students. The students need to come to the words themselves. We can go to the next slide. We went through all of the supplemental essays as well with the student. And then next slide. And then ultimately got to a final version. These supplemental essays showed the student as an inquisitive individual ready to contribute to the community with his unique interests and vibrant personality. And finally, last slide, the student ultimately got into Yale, Harvard, and Princeton, and was a Hans Scholar, which is really great. So this was a tremendous outcome for this student. One thing that I'll point out is that we didn't touch too much on the students' extracurricular activities, but here, doing the research, that was the key extracurricular experience. So for this student, it was absolutely essential. These do not happen without the research. So I would just point out that kind of extracurricular engagement is super important. Okay, I'll turn it back over to Dorothy, and I'm sorry that I ran over a few minutes here.
No worries. Just a reminder to everyone that this will be sent in an email. So because there was so much information, if you need to revisit anything, check your email tomorrow. So here are some more of our results. I won't go over them too much because we are over time, but I'll let you just look at these for a second. Here are some more results. And some more. Okay, so Joel did mention our programs briefly. So we offer families different programs based on their needs. So our candidacy building programs works with students in 9th grade for college admissions, and and in undergrad, the first year of college for our graduate school candidates. Our former admissions officers and our graduate coaches work to create an early strategy for the right kind of activities that you and your student could be doing to build a truly competitive and outstanding profile. So our academic mentorship program is for 8th grade through 11th grade and allows students to conduct individualized research programs, like I mentioned, with a professor, researcher, or scholar. And then our application counseling program starts the summer before senior year. So for some of you right now, and helps build that application persona, like Joel mentioned. So technology is failing me tonight. So normally there would be a poll. Tonight there is no poll, and that is okay. Because if you would like a free consultation or you have any other questions that we weren't able to answer tonight, please feel free to email the email on the screen. We would love to talk to all of you. Our free consultations will discuss your background. Oh, it's there. Perfect.
Yeah, I think it's just because you weren't a co-host. So I
perfect.
made you a co-host. There you go.
I was looking for that for a while. Thank you.
Problem.
Okay, so fill that out. You can also still give Vicki an email if you want to. She would love to hear from you. So when you hit yes on the poll, one of our team members will get back to you within 24 hours. The conversation will last for about 30 minutes. And we'll go over your background, some of your school choices, your goals. You can ask us any questions, and then we'll kind of go over a personalized plan that would best fit your student, your family's needs. So we are a little over. So do you want to answer a few questions?
Sure. I can get through a few of these.
Okay.
Will it be an added advantage if the student takes a class at college because his course is maxed out at the school in that subject? I think what you're asking is if the student takes a college class in high school, is that valuable? The answer is yes, but it's not essential, meaning I wouldn't say that's something that every student needs to do, but oftentimes I find that's a useful way of, like, once you've identified your passion or interest, try to take a college class, whether online or in person, in that subject to at least give yourself an educational foundation. How important is the honor section of the Common App? I have strong opinions on this. Our chief educational officer disagrees with me, and she's probably more credible in this regard. I'm a big believer that the activities list is vastly more important, and that the honors section is often useless. That doesn't mean always. It just means that for a lot of students, they're throwing things in there that, like, really aren't going to distinguish them. And so fundamentally, I think most of it can be valuable, but most of the time it's not. Whereas the activities list always has the opportunity to be super valuable if it's used correctly. Something to note is that the activities section, you have 10 activities. the amount of words that you can use to describe each activity, if you were to add all of those up, you're basically at like 75% of a personal statement. So that's how much kind of writing, and that's just the paragraphs that you write about them, how much writing you have in the activities list. It is super important. That's your resume. If a paper is drafted but not published, how to advocate for such paper. So we have relationships with a couple of peer-reviewed journals, and we host preprint servers for a number of journals as well. And so that's one of the ways that we do it. Obviously, the paper needs to like pass a quality threshold first, but that's sort of the way to do it. I would recommend, you basically just have to submit. In that case, if you're not working with an organization like ours, you basically find these, find journals and submit them. One journal is Inquiries Journal, is one that I know has been taking submissions relatively recently. How would you suggest adding humor to the application? It's hard to pull off. Humor is super hard to pull off. I don't have like a secret to that. Don't be raunchy. Don't use offensive humor. Nothing along those lines. Like keep it relatively PG. Ironic humor is good. Kind of dry humor, curb your enthusiasm type humor is good. I would say you need to get feedback. I would not get feedback from your friends. They're unlikely to have the sense of humor of the admissions officers. The most likely people that will have a similar sense of humor are your teachers, particularly your younger teachers. So I would have them read it. Younger meaning 30s, 20s and 30s. I would have them read it and see if they find it's funny. I find that a student or a parent's ability to gauge whether or not an essay is funny is not quite as good as an objective third party. How would I do STEM differently for computer science? Well, I used to say things like do artificial intelligence, but now that's like, that's what everybody's doing. But particular applications of AI, generative AI, machine learning, et cetera. Or it could be something like, coding games, like game development, stuff like that. Also kind of more specific. Again, go to a computer science department at UCLA, go to their website and just look at the class list. There will be a whole bunch of topics there that essentially could become an application persona. What if a student writes formally? I'm assuming this was about, it needs to sound like a student. It's fine if the student writes formally, but a 17-year-old is not going to sound like a highly educated 30-something-year-old. That's just not the way it works. It's pretty easy to tell the difference. So writing formally is fine. Although even the best students that we meet, they can be a little stiff. And so it's important for, students to be a little bit looser, a little more personable, a little more warm. Oftentimes when we're working with really, really type A students, they have an amazing resume and grades and test scores, but their ability to write in a way that makes them seem likable is diminished. And so we have to work with them on that. Is it worth taking an AP exam if you're not taking the AP class? It can be. It depends on what school you're at, how many APs people take there. I would say the only scenario in which I would say definitely you should do it is if it's the AP related to your core interest, in which case you should definitely do that. And then I see some thank yous. You're very welcome. If a student cannot take AP literature due to a schedule conflict, does it hurt application to MIT or other top schools? The only rule with APs in terms of subject areas, you need to take the APs that are related to your area of focus or interest. The remainder, which ones you take, are totally up to you. So AP literature specifically, no, that's unlikely to hurt. How would admissions officers see a student if the student has really strong extracurriculars, but has mediocre school grades and test scores? You still have a chance of getting in, depends on how strong your extracurriculars are. And it depends on why your grades and test scores are low. Like a student who moved here, didn't speak really good English, had a really bad GPA freshman and sophomore year, that's a really good excuse. If a student was just slacking off, not so much. But you still have a chance. I would rather have low grades and test scores and just the world's best extracurriculars than have the best test scores and grades and the worst extracurricular activities. Undoubtedly, that's the preference. For TJ students, what would be the GPA or SAT score that would help cross the threshold for top schools such as Yale, Penn, or Duke? So it's hard for me to say just off the top of my head. Like we have a school profile on TJ where I'm sure this information is. My guess is that it's it's somewhere in like the top 10% of the class. I don't know if we've broken that down by specific GPA, like at this GPA or higher, and whether it's unweighted or weighted. But being in the top 10%, if you were to be ranked, which not every school does, they don't, or at least they don't rank you and tell you about it. There's something similar to class rank in the school report that you don't see. But it's not exactly a class rank. It's like the student is at the top of the class, near the top of the class, at the middle of the class. So I don't know is the short answer, but let's say top 10% is probably the range academically for those schools, more like Duke and Penn than Yale. Probably for Yale, it's like top 5%. What activity can I do to stand out if I want to do mechanical engineering? Develop a new product. We had a student who developed an automated rice cooker where you basically poured water and rice into this thing and put in some bowls, and it would automatically dispense cooked bowls of rice. And then he set these up in churches all around town. Actually, he did this in New Haven, Connecticut, which is where I was living at the time, and fed the homeless. That's a great way of doing it. Alternatively, doing advanced research with a professor, great alternative. Do colleges value if the student continues a part of their education, even if it's not part of their persona? Yeah, sure. I mean, so colleges care if you take a rigorous course load. So even if it's not related to your area of interest, yeah, they care if you've taken a more rigorous course load in other areas. So yeah, definitely. How would you deal with a student who goes to a competitive STEM school but wants to do business? You'd combine them. So I don't know what STEM discipline the student is most interested in, but it's like easy to combine, for example, coding and businesses. You could create a software development company, or you could build an app and launch the app. You basically just hybridize the interests. So you just and almost anything could be combined with business. Even history could be combined with business. What are considered the highest level history classes? It really depends. I mean, the AP, US history, it's et cetera, but it depends on the school. So different schools have different offerings. The most advanced history class other than AP is college level. So worth keeping in mind. Okay, I think that takes us to the end. Thank you all very much for being such a wonderful audience and listening to me drone on. I hope it was super helpful. I see that around 20 of you have signed up for doing a free consultation. Strongly recommend that you do that. Just a good opportunity to sit down and talk through an individual student's needs. So hope to see some of you guys there. You are more than welcome, and hope to see you guys at the next event.
Thank you all for coming.
My pleasure. Bye, everybody.